In my speech, I'll be first providing the model and then including definitions, characterization, etc. And then next going on to our three main contentions. Our third contention will be further elaborated by the Deputy Prime Minister. So next going on to the model. First, definitions. As a significant inside this case refers to a large amount, as in 50% or more, like more of the artist's like queer following is like queer. So for example, when an artist has like 100 followers, more than 50 or like more people of their like that fan base must be queer for them to like count as a significant queer following. Next, low queer rights development. This low queer rights development may refer to inside these areas, inside these jurisdictions. Most people don't accept queer people and view their sexuality as illegal. And so also queer people are discriminated against and viewed in a negative light inside these areas. So this overall situation, like when artists refuse to perform in jurisdictions with low queer rights development, this looks like artists refusing to perform in areas like Indonesia, the United Arab Emirates, etc., due to the country's intolerance towards queer people. The artists are also typically supported towards queer people either due to personal beliefs or due to fear of being boycotted. And that is the characterization of the artists. So inside of my speech, I shall have like the main link, which is basically artists should advocate for queer people first. And so this will be effective, and then why this is important. So I'll be supporting this with my two main contentions. First contention, reputation. Artists depend a lot on their reputation for their careers and for their performing in these jurisdictions. So basically, performing in these jurisdictions with low queer rights development with significant queer following can result in unwanted negative rumors about these artists themselves. Basically, this looks like, for example, these artists going into these areas kind of means that they support what is going on inside of these areas. These artists are basically going there and performing in front of all these fans that might be basically extremely unsupportive of all this queer following. That's like extremely negative for the artists because they want to normally say that perhaps they're very like inclusive towards various different groups of people. We want to say that they're like very friendly and very inclusive and very just all various kinds of like beneficial pronouns. But inside that case, if artists actually perform in front of a large group of people that are actually like, for example, not very tolerant towards these queer people, that basically means that the artists are also kind of like supported towards the people that disagree with queer people's own existence. That's extremely bad. That can cause a lot of rumors because it's kind of implying that the artists themselves are intolerant. When these wrong rumors start spreading and when people start like associating these artists with anti-queer, a negative reputation for the artists in these areas starts to form in a very bad way. That can actually ruin an artist's career if their reputation rots out just because of their queer following. This happens because these artists are basically like performing in these areas very blatantly, was like completely aware that these areas are like very intolerant towards the queer people, yet they're still performing. Like that's extremely horrible, and it's basically kind of implying that the artists are viewing queer people as inhuman or basically viewing them in a negative light too. Now, now that we have basically proven how artists should be advocating for queer people because, well, they kind of worry for their reputation, don't they? Artists worry for their own reputation because they depend, as I said before, on their reputations for their careers. And basically, because they need their reputation to have a stable fan base and maintain said fan base, they need to make sure that they aren't like being anti-queer or implying that they are anti-queer by performing in areas that have low queer rights development. So basically why artists from their own perspectives should be advocating for the queer people. Next, why will this kind of advocacy be effective? This links on to our second contention. So our second contention is queer rights advocacy. Through their rights, the artists and through their actions, the artists can make it very clear that they are unwilling to acknowledge countries that are intolerant toward those who discriminate against queer people. So through the process of basically, for example, refusing to perform and opening concerts in other areas, they can raise awareness about LGBTQ plus rights because they typically are extremely famous artists. So their actions normally cause extremely big impacts on society. That's basically the same as like every other artist doing everything else. So sometimes artists can wear a piece of clothing and the next day you see that that clothing is out of style because like it's like sold out or stuff like that. So that simply happens towards ideologies. When the artists themselves acknowledge that they are actually supportive of like these kinds of queer rights, the people, their fan base also start supporting these queer rights because they most of the time they view the artist as like a model figure. So they start doing whatever the artists also do. So they follow after the artists. So this actually causes like twofold impacts. First impact, the countries and the citizens of the countries with less queer rights are encouraged to establish said rights. Those who lived outside of the jurisdiction of of these anti-queer countries will also pressure them to advocate for queer people. This is because most of these like parties, like the countries that have less queer rights, some of them also like recognize that if they've been kind of called out for being like anti-queer to some extent, and so they don't want to be known with a negative light on an international scale, do they? Because they want to maintain and like international relations and also maintain their own like basically their like good reputation in an international scale. So they will also advocate for queer people. Second impact is overall inclusivity. The entire world will start acknowledging everyone's differences, and this fosters a more caring environment for everyone. So LGBTQ plus people are still humans. By caring for them, we are caring for human rights, quite literally. So overall, because the artists can actually acknowledge that they're supportive of these like LGBTQ plus rights, they themselves are actually encouraging kind of undistinctly but still pretty obviously their own like fans to do the same and also become extremely inclusive. At this point, are there any POIs? 3, 2, 1. Assuming that there are none, I will continue explaining our impacts. So because of this kind of impacts, and also because of the kind of thing that can happen to artists that perhaps are homophobic or whatever, therefore the artist has an incentive to advocate for queer rights and to speak up for these queer rights, or choosing not to perform in areas that do not have queer rights. The artists may also advocate for these rights to prevent themselves from being boycotted and prevent themselves from having a horrible reputation, as I mentioned before. For example, Kanye West was called out for being homophobic a while ago, and now he's kind of being just boycotted overall. He doesn't really have that successful of a career at this point. And as other artists can also recognize that, and also as artists have an incentive to make sure that their own careers are still successful and are still working rather well, they have an incentive too to be pressured to actually start supporting queer rights, or at least appear as though they support these queer rights in that case. So that can also lead on to basically the rest of society similarly following after the artist's own steps, and also about advocating for rights for pretty much all humans. Like regardless of the sexuality of these people, their rights will still be advocated for. Overall, because artists basically not allowing artists to like perform in jurisdictions with low queer rights development will actually like basically incentivize the artists to advocate for these queer rights, and actually will be rather successful inside of that case of like basically advocating for said rights. Overall, we strongly urge for a government ballot and urge that the motion is absolutely valid. Thank you.
In the status quo, one of the biggest aims of the queer movement is to promote the acceptance of the queer community across all across the globe, and to advocate for queer rights in places that do not already have them in place. We are currently on the mission to build universal solidarity in the queer movement, and allowing artists who have significant queer followings to perform in places without many queer rights will only show weakness in the belief of whether or not queer people should be accepted globally. So why should we prevent artists from doing just that? Why should we take away both artists' freedom of expression and simultaneously show a false sense of weakness and vulnerability in the queer community? This is the world that side proposition proposes, and this is exactly the world that we, side opposition, are trying to prevent from becoming reality. Today, I will be discussing about how allowing artists to perform in jurisdictions with low queer rights development will build universal solidarity in the queer movement, and how it will promote the freedom of expression of both artists with significant queer following and of the queer group itself. The deputy leader of the opposition will be talking about how this will be a step on the way to accepting queer people globally, and the opposition whip and opposition reply will conclude this debate. So before I proceed with my substantive, I would like to rebut a few arguments in the government's case. So they have stated that if artists perform in places with low queer rights development, this implies that such artists will develop reputations of being anti-queer, as they are performing in places which are also anti-queer. However, this is clearly false, as by performing in places with low queer rights development, they're actually promoting queer rights, and as I will explain later, this actually develops universal solidarity in the queer movement, and thus it encourages more people to support the queer group, and it clearly does not develop reputations of these artists as being anti-queer. So now back to my substantive. Primarily, if we allow artists with significant queer following to perform in jurisdictions with low queer rights development, this will promote the universal solidarity of the queer and LGBTQIA+ movement. In the status quo, queer people are expressing themselves more and more in an effort to become widely known, and in order for the queer movement to gain a lot of universal solidarity, understanding, and support. This works because when people see large groups of queer people unashamedly expressing themselves, this shows others that the queer movement is quite a strong one, and the lack of self-doubt in the queer movement from queer people highly encourages others to support the queer movement. This method of gaining support for the queer movement is currently happening a lot around the globe and is working extraordinarily well. However, the proposition is proposing to show a sense of false weakness in the queer movement by stopping artists with large queer followings to perform in jurisdictions that they have low queer rights development, and thus risk reducing the universal solidarity that the queer movement has gained. To illustrate, if we stopped allowing this, then people observing the queer movement, people observing the other queer people, would gain a false belief that the queer movement is so weak that they will not be able to stand up in the opposition, in the people who believe that queer rights should not be upheld. Instead of making artists back down from performing in jurisdictions in which queer rights are not developed, doing the opposite would in fact show the rest of the world the strength of the queer movement and the strength of the queer movement and the strength that it has developed over the years with the support of all the queer followers, thus developing its universal solidarity as well as gaining support from the people inside the jurisdiction that opposes queer rights itself. This is incredibly important as it affects all of the people in the queer movement and many people in low queer rights development jurisdictions, as this will likely gain a lot of support for the queer movement from these jurisdictions, and so will slowly but surely, at least a lot faster than the government side, it will reduce it will increase the amount of queer followers in the low queer rights development jurisdiction, and thus reverse this issue. Furthermore, if we do not allow artists with significant queer following to perform in jurisdictions with low queer rights development, then we are limiting these artists' freedom of expression, as well as that of the queer movement. In the status quo, artists are given the right to freedom of expression, regardless of their following, and are able to perform whatever they want, should they have the qualifications to. All people are also given the freedom of expression to express whatever opinions they want, and it is even considered morally wrong to demote a particular social group with slightly different views on the world if it does not necessarily harm anyone. The biggest example of which is the queer group. In the world that side proposition is proposing, not only are we stripping freedom of expression from artists with significant queer following, which is morally unfair as, like I've stated beforehand, all artists should be allowed to perform at any location of their choice, given that they have the qualification and skill to. But we are also taking away the freedom of expression and the freedom of choice from queer groups. To illustrate, all people have the obligation to go wherever they want, given that they do not commit any criminal activity. So the queer group should not have these limitations either. Just because an artist has a significant queer following, this does not make it just nor morally right to prevent them from performing in jurisdictions with low queer rights development. Overall, the right to freedom of expression is extremely unfair to give to both. Overall, the right to freedom of expression is necessary to give to both of the mentioned stakeholders, and we have the obligation to provide this right to all people, regardless of their following or their beliefs. And if we do not provide this right to the mentioned stakeholders, this will be affecting a huge amount of people, and the severity of this effect will also be quite immense. Overall, these effects far outweigh those on the government side of the House, and thus this is why I am proud to oppose.
George, I want to remind you, while opposition side has been talking a lot about how the queer movement is important, we do not actually disagree with that, but they do not mention in the first part talking about the queer movement, what does this actually have to do with artists themselves? And I'll move on to doing some refutation specifically and doing some rebuilding to what they have attacked on our argument. First, they mentioned on our first argument, they attacked it by saying that this won't actually happen because performing there will be promoting the rights of queer people because it shows that their own confidence in the movement themselves. I'll deal with this logic a little bit later when I weigh both logic of both teams when it comes to queer movements. And move on to stating the first argument, I believe, is talking about the universal solidarity of the movement because they should express themselves. And these artists with queer following performing in jurisdictions with low queer rights development actually support the queer movement because it shows certainty and confidence into in their own movement. And they say that our side shows uncertainty with the queer movement. And we want to say, what does this actually have to do with artists themselves? I believe the other side's argument is a generalization of the queer movement itself. Queer following for these artists does not necessarily mean that the artists are queer or are necessarily like in the queer movement themselves. Why do we have to press on the artists with this particular like goal that the other side has set to show certainty in the queer movement while coming at a big cost to these artists determining on their reputation themselves. So in this case, what does this actually have to do with artists? Can't movements themselves do this in exactly the same way, like protest, like demonstrations or protests or actual people there going to these areas with to these jurisdictions with low queer rights development and expressing themselves there? Why do we have to necessarily sacrifice artists? So in this case, we believe it's actually better for artists to not perform in these kind of jurisdictions. I'll explain a little bit more why later, but the majority of this explanation was done by our first speaker as saying how actually this harms their own reputation when it comes to performing in areas with low queer rights. This will develop a wrong reputation, a reputation amongst those following them, those people who are queer and are following these artists. Now move on to the second argument, talking about freedom of expression. We don't actually like disagree with that point. Freedom of expression do exist on our side, on their side, but this freedom of expression actually comes at some cost, at a cost to the artist because of their reputation. As you had said so many times, most artists, especially those people who are in the entertainment field, depend on their reputation for their careers. And in this negative reputation for these artists, when they go into their areas, that these negative reputations that form among those people following them, among those queer followers, actually comes at a huge cost to their own reputation. And if that reputation rots out and these rumors spread to say that these artists themselves are actually anti-queer, this negative reputation amongst those queer all followings can actually lead to the whole reputation to just rot, because who knows what kind of things these people can actually invent, where they're really angry at the artists for actually going to an area where they with low queer rights. And another piece of logic here is that also this may also seem like weird for those people who love living in these low queer rights development areas, because these people might associate these people who think queer, who actually disagree with the queer movement, or who think queer are just weird people or people who are just mentally wrong. These people, they will associate the artists with the following together, and those people who have no mind for queer rights, and they will associate queer, which is a bad thing in their mind, with the artists themselves. And this can also cause wrong rumors to spread in that region themselves and also among the queer following of those artists. And that can lead just to the reputation of the whole artist to just rot away on both sides of the debate happening about queer rights and anti-queer rights. So in a way, this is bad for the artist. And we don't necessarily have to sacrifice the artist to do all of this. Why can't the movement itself do it? And all these impacts talking about the universal solidarity of the movement themselves, we believe that the most essential part is individual people in that movement themselves, expressing themselves, not necessarily sacrificing artists who depend a lot on their reputation, which could potentially rot on both sides of the queer. Yes?
Artists can help the people that are actually in the movement express themselves, and artists can be very helpful for them to express their own rights rather than them having to independently do it.
So you're trying to say that artists could also be like very helpful in this case, but like when it comes to artists, there's a huge actual risk, and like these artists have a whole entire career maybe dependent upon this reputation, which may just rot because of this one, because of going into performing these areas with low queer rights. But these normal people, they could just express away with their own feelings. They don't necessarily need, at least the majority of them don't need to depend on their reputation as queer or not for their own career themselves. They could just protest and demonstrate and express themselves that they are just queer and they could be equally wonderful as all other people out there. So in this case, the movement itself, those everyday people in the movement themselves has much more power, and the whole scale of the movement itself has much more power than individual artists actually like sacrificing parts of their reputation, parts of their career to simply go into this area. So we believe it's actually better for these artists themselves. And lastly, I'll go on to mentioning an additional argument to further our impact for my partner in her first speech. So further the impact, when and this comes to a part where we weigh both sides' logic for who actually advocates for queer rights. The other says that when we express ourselves, when we show confidence in the movement in these areas of low queer rights development, we can actually show confidence and certainty for the movement itself. And outside says that because these artists are intolerant towards those areas which discriminate against queer people, they choose not to perform there. And these people who are aware of LGBTQ and queer rights actually think that these artists are not tolerant of anti-queer people. They're not tolerant of these ideas that discriminate against anti-queer people, and thus the movement could actually go on because they refuse to acknowledge areas and these specific areas, ideas that queer people are just weird people or mentally ill people. So in this way, this counter way to say that I don't agree with this kind of point of view, so I will not perform there for these artists, this kind of counter view is much more valuable for queer people. Because in a way, going there could sacrifice part of your career and sacrifice part of your reputation for the queer movement along with yourself. But in this way, it shows pretty, yeah. Okay. Should I finish my sentence? Okay, I'll just finish it. So in this way, these artists could protect their own reputation and further the queer movement itself. Thank you.
Before I begin my speech, I'd like to point out some obvious flaws in the opposition's case. First of all, they asked that they talked about the artist's reputation and how it would be damaged, as it looks unqueer to go and perform in unqueer places. However, this is simply not true. First of all, just because the artist performs there, it doesn't mean that they are against queer people. But even if people still conjure rumors such as this, artists aren't stopped from performing in queer places. In order to maintain a strong fan base, they will still perform in places with high queer rights to reinforce their fans in queer places. They will also perform in places without queer rights, not to act against queer people, but to show that they are trying to spread the queer movement. If an artist is initially associated with the queer movement, their actions will always be seen initially as the support of the queer movement. People will not suddenly think that this artist is not supportive of the queer movement. This point simply does not stand. Furthermore, the opposition stated that by performing in these places with low queer rights, it becomes clear that the artist is unwilling to acknowledge people in these discriminatory places. While this is true, when artists only perform in places with queer rights, they will undeniably create echo chambers in which people with already substantial acceptance of queer people are only reinforced with their ideas. This could actually lead to negative impacts, such as more violent protests as a result of consistently being polarized in their beliefs. However, if an artist goes to perform in discriminatory places, then they will be able to demonstrate to the discriminatory people why queer people should be accepted. Again, this falls to the same logic. If an artist is initially supported by queer people, then their actions will always be initially perceived as an action for the queer people. I will explain later how by performing in the queer discriminatory areas, these areas slowly become accepting of queer people. Even if the opposition is true and this artist is seen as anti-queer, this view will quickly change and be lost as the queer people see the change that the artist has created in these discriminatory places. Furthermore, the opposition stated that people who don't like queer people, who know that queer people won't enjoy the artist, causing wrong rumors and losing following for the artist. However, by the artist performing, these people who don't like queer people will always be able to experience the power of a famous person, even if they don't go to the concert, whether it simply be people leaving work to go to a concert, or family members telling them that there is a concert. It is always true that people in a jurisdiction will be affected by an artist if they come to a queer discriminatory place, especially if that artist is extremely famous. And as I will explain later, this experience with queer people or queer morals through this artist will create a chain reaction that does eventually lead to acceptance of queer people in these discriminatory jurisdictions. Now onto my substantive. Music and art has the power to transcend boundaries, challenge stereotypes, and promote minorities. Furthermore, artists can act as a catalyst for change in social movements, especially movements with strong backing from the arts, i.e. queer movements. In the opposition's world, they seek to constantly crush the queer movements, which are a collection of extremely vulnerable movements that seek to express themselves through art. By completely crushing the most vulnerable people in the equation, the opposition seeks to do nothing that is beneficial for the general population. In fact, they do much more harm than good. However, in our case, we are able to provide a voice and enhance these queer minorities by simultaneously embracing the solidarity of the movement, empowering the freedom of speech that queer or queer-supported artists do deserve, as my first speaker have proven, and also act as a stepping stone towards global acceptance of these queer movements. How can we accomplish this? Through allowing artists in jurisdictions with low rights developments to perform. By allowing artists to keep on performing in low queer rights movements, we consistently create a positive loop of queer reaffirmation, not just in places where queer has already been accepted, but also in places where queer people are potentially not as acknowledged as they rightfully should be. Artists have an immense amount of power that is given to them through their following and fans. Furthermore, through their music, artists have the power, as I've already mentioned, to transcend boundaries, challenge stereotypes, and promote minorities. Quite evidentially, artists who are supported by the queer following have the ability to bring the queer movement to potentially discriminatory jurisdictions. This can happen both physically and metaphorically. For example, queer artists, by performing in places without queer rights, will undoubtedly bring along their fans, which contain a significant number of queer people. As queer people are integrated into a discriminatory society, even for a very short period of time, they can bond together with the emotionally driven music, and slowly the discriminatory society is able to understand the queer people on a whole new level. Music has this power because it is able to make people feel at ease and relaxed. They will realize that they feel at ease with queer values and start to understand those queer values. Understanding is the first step against discrimination, as understanding leads to knowledge, knowledge leads to sympathy, and sympathy leads to acceptance. All of this is extremely intuitive. In addition, artists need to meet the demands of their audience. Queer artists' music will reinforce queer themes, values, and identities. As a discriminatory society experiences and enjoys the music, their subconscious or even conscious mind will slowly start to accept these queer values. If they are enjoying it, it can't be that bad, right? Again, understanding leads to knowledge, knowledge leads to sympathy, and sympathy leads to acceptance. Clearly, by allowing queer artists to perform in places where queer rights haven't been fully established, we are able to integrate the queer society, values, morals, identities, and people. Through this integration, added with the relaxing emotional power of music, people in these discriminatory jurisdictions are able to understand the queer values on a whole new level. As I've mentioned multiple times, understanding leads to knowledge, knowledge leads to sympathy, and sympathy leads to acceptance. However, why is this good? Essentially, through these concerts, these discriminatory jurisdictions learn to accept queer people on the whole. Through this acceptance, more queer rights will be advocated for in these areas which lack queer rights. Excuse me. Through this acceptance, more queer rights will be advocated for in these areas which lack queer rights. More people could become open about their identities, further solidifying the queer population in these areas without queer rights. Slowly, through a musical performance, this place which was once so averse to queer people, has the potential to become a strong advocate and example of an inclusive society. The opposition's case attempts to destroy the possibility of such a beneficial change in thinking for the whole jurisdiction, and therefore I am proud to negate. Thank you.
The biggest mistake that our opponents are making in today's debate is that they assume that when these artists go to these areas with discrimination to perform, their music would definitely impact the discriminatory people there and lead to these people changing their beliefs. Though we do not deny that this artist's music can contain a lot of areas that are anti-discrimination. What is extremely difficult for our opponents to assume is that these people would definitely accept the artist's music and that they would definitely, because of the artist's music, be able to change their ideas. Why is that so? That is because these people have been living in this discriminatory society for such a long time. They have been living in this society that everyone around them has been giving them this idea, they have been living in this society that discriminate is really prevalent. And just because a few pieces of music that is going to their society would not change really anything, because this belief is quite built inside of them. And this music, although powerful towards those who do believe in this kind of belief, will not be able to or sufficient to alter the current belief. So that is why we need these artists not to go to these discriminatory places with discrimination, to warn against these people that what they are doing is wrong. The artist's action of not going there can act as an alert based on action, not just words, but an alert based on action, an alert that what they are doing is not not welcomed by other people and not believed by others. For example, like these powerful artists, but on this action of telling them what they are doing is wrong can work, that they can make these people feel that they are actually doing something wrong and they're actually receiving negative impacts because that, for example, like they are losing artists who come to their places to perform. This negative impact that they are actually feeling through this
POI.
action can actually make them change their beliefs. Yes, POI.
If these queer discriminatory places supposedly don't like queer people and they don't like, then by logic they don't like queer artists, then by withholding the queer artists from these places which are queer discriminatory, how is that a punishment?
Firstly, like these artists, they are very famous artists, and so because of their famous, like cities will want them to go to their cities to perform, right? And okay, so that is first why artists not going to their cities to perform can be considered as harm for that city. Secondly, based on what you have said, like these cities, they don't like queer people, right? Based on your logic, they do not accept this artist who also who also has queer followers. So what would this lead to? This leads to my second point, that when these artists like they bring their followers to that world, this further supports our point that these queer followers of the artist would not be supported. It would not be able to blend in to the background, the societal background in those places with a lot of discrimination. They will only be further discriminated. They will not be able to be seen as queer people who can be accepted by others. In that society where discrimination is extremely prevalent, these queer people will only be discriminated because, even as our opponents state themselves, like these people, they are extreme. These people in these more discriminatory areas are discriminatory towards these people. And if these people, as our opponents claim, are discriminatory also towards the artists, that makes them even harder to take the artist's words, and that makes them even harder to believe that the artist's music can be able to influence their minds and actually cause them to not to discriminate against people. So that is why, like, our opponent's point that artists going to that country will be that place with a lot of discrimination can actually resolve the discrimination. So with that, we're going to move on to weighing. The two questions in today's debate is, firstly, which side benefits more artists and followers? We say that it is our side. That is because these artists, as we have our first speaker already mentioned in her first point, this benefits reputation of artists, as these artists will not be seen as people who go to these places with a lot of discrimination. Our opponents argue that where this places goes does not necessarily mean what this artist believes. But even if that is not the artist's intention, many people believe where these artists travel, where these artists bring their followers, are places where these artists believe that they like, because like most people, they go to places to perform where they like these places. They don't usually go to places that they really dislike to perform. So that is the reason why many people will view these artists as the people who are perhaps more inclined towards discrimination, which definitely ruins the reputation of artists. But this also has an impact on the artist's followers. Consider these followers who are more queer people, and they have gotten acceptance from the society, and they are actually supporting this artist. But then this artist goes to places to perform where this society does not does not accept these queer followers. So this can make these queer followers feel extremely pressured, and also these followers would dislike this artist because they believe that this artist is supporting causes that are actually harming them. So this is not only causing pressure, this is not only negatively affecting these followers, but these followers, after they are negatively affected, they're also negatively affecting this artist. So in our opponent's world, if these artists go to these places with a lot of discrimination to perform, what will happen is that the followers will feel extremely sad. The artists will lose their good reputation. So that will be a lose-lose situation. Like now we are going to move on to our second way of weighing is who in the end are able to resolve discrimination. We say it is our side because like as we have already like painted this world, in our world, artists do not go to these places to perform. These places of people would be able to see that this artist who is like really famous, who is going to other places to perform, is exclusively not coming to their city. So this can make the people of that place to realize there would be some problem that is going on in their city that is leading to this artist not coming there. And only through this realizing a problem, realizing that something like because of their thoughts, because of their actions, something tangible is actually happening to them, will this place be able to realize that it is actually doing something wrong and they need to change? Simply by like bringing these artists to these places, as our opponent have stated, would not be able to change the mind of these people, because as they even agree themselves, like these people does not really like value the words of these artists, and thus the songs of these artists would not be able to change their mind. Thank you.
I would first like to provide some rebuttal to the opposition's team for statements, and then I will conduct some weighing and conclude my team's case. First and foremost, I would like to address the statement made by the proposition that by performing in places that don't have a broad view on queer rights, it has no impact on queer people getting recognized. However, here are some reasons as to why that is false. A. Creating safe spaces. Concert venues and events where artists perform can be controlled environments where organizers can prioritize safety and security measures. Many venues have policies against discrimination and harassment, and they work together to create inclusive spaces for all attendees, including queer individuals. B. Increasing visibility. Public performances by artists can increase the visibility of queer individuals and issues in communities that may not have had much exposure to LGBTQ plus culture. This visibility can lead to greater understanding and empathy and support for queer rights among the general public. Also, if countries get the attention of having an artist perform in their country, isn't that a privilege? Countries will want to have artists visit their country, and therefore artists would be extremely helpful in advocating for change and challenging discrimination practices. Artists have a huge impact on the perception of any people. Even if people can't accept the artist due to their association with queer people, they will eventually be forced to accept queer people as queer fans keep on coming back to these discriminatory places. The artists themselves are not the only way that people can accept queer people through. Another point that the proposition has stated is that artists are sacrificing their reputation or their career to support queer people. However, we want to look in a new perspective. This sacrifice is an honorable act of great courage, helping to create positive social movement in our flawed world as promoters of healthy change. Also, it is an assumption to think that an artist will lose their whole career because of a single choice. They would obviously have the fans that are actually queer, and therefore they won't lose the whole career. The first speaker of the proposition has stated that artists will be performing in front of people that they're not tolerant towards queer people, and she proceeded to say that the artists will be leaning to supporting people that are not queer because of their fans. However, this is false for the following reasons. A. The motion for this round states that these artists heavily support queer people, which is definite, and I don't see where the evidence is, given that artists will start to not support queer people. B. The people that this artist will be performing in front of are most likely the artist's fans, which will likely support the artist and their endeavors because they like the artist for whatever reason. An artist wouldn't choose a location to perform in if it didn't have a high concentration of their fans. And these fans wouldn't support the artist if the artist had a feature they didn't like, in this case, supporting queer rights. This is why this point does not stand. If the artists are supporters of the queer movement, why can't they simply go back to those places to reinforce their message and over time change a discriminatory society? Another statement that the proposition team has made is this: artists should have the responsibility to protect their LGBTQ plus fans from potential harm. This is true. However, it can be done in other ways. Artists would advocate for these rights to be upheld in a certain country, making the LGBTQ plus population safer. Artists are well known for promoting positive change, and by engaging with diverse audiences and challenging prejudices, they can contribute meaningfully to the ongoing struggle for LGBTQ plus rights worldwide. Art is a catalyst for change. Throughout history, art and music have played pivotal roles in social movements and advancing civil rights. Artists performing in challenging environments can contribute to the gradual evolution of societal norms and attitudes towards LGBTQ+ rights worldwide. I would now like to move on to my weighing. We believe that the opposition team has won this debate based on the metric of vulnerability, which refers to how vulnerable a certain stakeholder is in an argument. In this case, those that are considered queer. The proposition may argue that by supporting queer supporting artists by visiting the countries that do not support them, it endangers the LGBTQ+ population. However, we believe that it is only through an artist's advocacy for social change, justice, and understanding we can contribute meaningfully to the ongoing struggle for LGBTQ+ rights worldwide. Queer supporting artists should perform in countries that do not support queer people to challenge prejudices, promote visibility, and advocate for equality through their art and presence. Their performances can spark dialogue, inspire change, and demonstrate solidarity with queer communities worldwide. Artists have the right, as my speakers have already said, artists should have the right to freedom of expression and should not be restricted from performing based on the political or social climate of a particular location. Limiting their ability to perform based on these factors could infringe upon their rights and artistic integrity. Promoting dialogue and change. Engaging with diverse audiences, including those in jurisdictions with differing views on queer rights, provides opportunities for constructive dialogue and mutual understanding. Artists can use their platform to advocate for change and challenge discriminatory practices. In conclusion, artists performing in places that don't support queer people do not inherently endanger either queer people or themselves. Instead, such performances can foster positive change, increase visibility and acceptance, support local communities, and uphold the principles of freedom of expression and cultural exchange. We should be setting a positive example by publicly announcing decisions to inspire an artist's single decision that can inspire other performers, activists, and individuals to take a stand for LGBTQ+ rights. This can contribute to broader awareness and advocacy efforts worldwide. Artists should have a moral and ethical obligation to not avoid performing in jurisdictions with low queer rights of development to avoid legitimizing discrimination, protect the safety of queer individuals, and promote positive social change through principled action and advocacy. With all of this in mind, I am proud to negate.
So over the course of this speech, what I'd like to do first is make some rebuttals on the government's case, and then I'd like to go over the two major clashes in this debate. So firstly, the government has stated that since jurisdictions with low queer rights development have grown up with the belief that queer people are morally wrong, if artists come with large, significant queer followings come to perform in such jurisdictions with a significant then the people of the jurisdictions will, with the lack of rights for the queer people, will not be affected at all, and instead they will shun the coming of the artist. So to this we say that by the same logic, these jurisdictions actually will not be affected if artists with significant queer following are banned from performing in that place instead, and instead such a jurisdiction will likely be happy if the artist is banned from performing there, so as they won't any longer pose a supposed threat to their moral beliefs that queer people are wrong. And instead, these jurisdictions will undergo no change, unlike the government has stated, if artists with significant queer following is banned from going to such jurisdictions, and they will instead be significantly more. Instead, it'll be significantly more effective for artists with such followings to perform in that jurisdiction directly, for what both the leader of opposition and the deputy leader of opposition have stated. So now the government has also stated that the government side has also falsely claimed several times that if artists with significant queer followings perform in places with low queer rights development, this will lead to these artists gaining bad anti-queer reputations. On the contrary, this action will actually show the confidence of the queer people in their movement. And it'll also, as the leader of opposition has already stated in their speech several times, it'll also develop the universal solidarity of this queer movement, and will be far more effective at gaining support from the queer for the queer movement, both from that jurisdiction itself and from other jurisdictions, than the solution that government proposes, which is to ban artists with significant queer followers from performing in low queer rights development jurisdictions. So now the main mistake on the government side is that the reputation of artists is that they have claimed that the reputation of artists is surely going to be bad. However, the reputation of such artists is not necessarily made bad, as the artist has the choice of whether or not to perform in a low queer rights development jurisdiction. Artists do not have to perform in such jurisdictions, and so even if their reputation would get damaged, which I've already explained why this would not happen, they are not required to perform in such jurisdictions, and so they do not necessarily have to damage their reputation, as government says. Furthermore, the government side is different because it clearly shows that there is a fear of weakness in the queer movement by banning such artists from performing in jurisdictions that have low queer rights development, whereas on the opposition side of the House, no such ban is made, and so there is no immensely negative effect on the queer group. Instead, artists with a significant queer following still have the ability to bring their queer following to such a jurisdiction, but if they feel falsely that their reputation will get damaged, and if they do not want to do so, then they still retain the option not to perform in such a jurisdiction. Now to the major clashes of this debate. Which side decreases queer discrimination and increases queer following more? Clearly, it is the opposition side, as we have as we have shown the flaws in their main and only argument regarding this clash. That says that reputations of artists will get damaged, and so they will not perform in such places. So this is how we win this clash. And secondly, the second clash, which one will be better for the artist? We propose a world in which the artist gets freedom of choice and freedom of expression, whereas they falsely claim whereas the government. Oh, sorry.
So let's start with two clashes. First, who actually benefits the artists themselves, and second, who benefits the queer rights movement. First, on the artists themselves. Judge, we already said so many times, the reputation is very important for their whole career, and reputation can rot on both sides of the debate concerning queer and anti-queer movements, because queer following can see their own the people they're following performing in areas with anti-queer ideas. So in this case, the reputation rots among queer followers, and also the reputation rots on the other side as well, because they see this person who's supporting an idea who they don't agree with performing in their area. So most likely that there will be attacked on reputation from both sides of the debate about queer movements. So in this case, it's a lose-lose situation for those people, for those queer followers, and for those artists themselves. The other side is given two responses. First, they will not automatically lose their career, but have you any idea about how reputation is so important for these artists themselves? Who do you stand with, and where do you perform with, and what do you do means a lot to all those people down there. Don't just say I can do something and I can just fall by randomly. Maybe it's not that much of a big deal by performing in these areas, but in the end, it can actually translate to a huge deal when it comes to those people down there watching you perform. So in this case, this reputation matters a lot for these artists. And then on that. And secondly, they tell us that they can make a trade-off. But we want to say that the movement can do it themselves. The movement, individual people in the movement can express their own ideas as well. Why do you need to necessarily trade off these artists? They don't have an absolute obligation to do all these things just by having a queer following themselves. They may not even show that much of a queer movement arguments themselves. So what kind of obligation do they have? Why shouldn't the movement do this? Why can't the movement actually do it better with individual people expressing themselves? In a way, what made the Black Lives Matter movement and so many civil rights movements in the United States so powerful was individual people expressing their own rights. That in the end was what actually won those movements in other places, and that's what we believe can also happen here. The other side secondly mentioned lastly mentioned that there was freedom of expression. We want to say yes, we agree freedom of expression, but we shouldn't sacrifice artists for the movement because they don't necessarily have an obligation for the movement just because they have a queer following. And moving on to the second part, the queer movement itself, who benefits it? Notice I have said two things. First, by performing there, we can solidify confidence in this movement, and by performing with arts and music, we can change opinions and gradually change the opinions of people there who are anti-queer to starting to support the queer movement itself. But as our first speakers pointed out, is that really guaranteed? That is one of the biggest holes in this argument, is that won't necessarily happen. What about a backlash? What about a backlash that could happen to these artists because those people in anti-queer areas or in areas with less queer rights development, why can't they backlash against this particular artist and rot their reputation and rot their whole career because of this thing? Who knows what kind of things they do and what they say could be translated to something that might just ruin their career in just one move. People underestimate the power of these following and of these people's down there of their ideas. So in that case, what is not guaranteed that performing there will change their opinions. So Judge, our way of doing it, intolerance, actually works better. Just like when you want to persuade somebody on this really weird idea that that queer people are just not like normal people, when you want to persuade those people who are anti-queer, intolerance works better. Telling them that what they're doing is wrong, it's better than just like telling them what exactly is right and expressing yourselves. This intolerance from famous or select artists in this way, this intolerance just shows them that in itself, this idea is just wrong and we're not willing to cooperate with you or perform there if you keep on having these ideas that are discriminating against queer people. So in the end, this does much more better job for the queer movement and supporting queer people's rights. Thank you.